Today we're talking about the Eric Staal trade once more, and if you saw the video that we made already when the trade actually happened, you would have seen our take on the matter. Our take was pretty much similar to everybody else's take, that Eric Staal, Marcus Johansson, if you trade these guys one for one, the team that is getting Eric Staal wins, just by the matter of the fact that their contracts both go for one more year, the fact that Eric Staal is better than Marcus Johansson, and pretty much the only thing that the Minnesota Wild are getting here is the fact that Marcus Johansson is younger. But, for the most part, everybody kind of agreed. Buffalo won the Staal trade. The length of time, that doesn't really matter because at the end of the day, it's two one-year contracts that have been swapped, and Eric Staal's is just the one that has more oomph to it because the player behind the contract is much better. Or at least, that's what everybody has kind of been saying. But we have ourselves a few little tidbits from guys like Elliotte Friedman that kind of indicate the overall shock as to how Eric Staal was feeling when this trade was actually made, because, believe me, I was surprised to see this trade go down, you were surprised to see this trade go down, everybody was, especially considering the assets involved. But it comes as no surprise, or maybe to some surprise to some, depending who you ask, that apparently the biggest one who was shocked out of everybody was actually Eric Staal himself. So, let's go over onto this article here. First and foremost, BuffaloHockeyBeat.com. What this article did was it took a look at some of the quotes that Eric Staal had during a Zoom call on Friday. He spoke about Kevin Adams, the Buffalo Sabres general manager, and in fact, a former teammate of Staal's back in the Carolina system 17 years ago. He was very good to me as a young player in Carolina. I was at his house numerous times. As a young guy, we just got along really well. He then noted how he didn't really expect his former colleague to actually make a trade for him, and then he labeled his overall emotion towards the trade. The initial shock of everything was the biggest emotion I felt, and we felt. It's been a great fit here in Minnesota for me and for my family. We really integrated well, and not only on the rink for me, but for my kids, my wife, and to me, that is the most important thing. When you get that kind of news that you've been traded, pretty much out of the blue, it throws you for a little bit of a loop. But we've been able to process here a little bit more over the last 2 days or so. We can adapt to change, and we can move forward, and that's what we're going to do. And we're excited about the opportunity and the challenge that's ahead. So even if Eric Staal and his family are uncomfortable with moving away from Minnesota because it appears that they have really settled down there, at the very least, Eric Staal is only playing for 1 year in Buffalo before his contract expires, and before he can either, I don't know, retire, or go somewhere else, or maybe even try to return to Minnesota, who knows. We have ourselves this interesting little tidbit, though, mentioned by Elliotte Friedman, because when it comes to what the overall sentiment is, everybody kind of knows based off of the quotes, Eric Staal and his family, they very much like Minnesota, but they're not going to be there anymore because he got traded to Buffalo. So take a look at this tweet over here. This is from NHL Watcher. It summarizes what Elliotte Friedman said on the most recent episode of the Instigators podcast. He says that Eric Staal turned down about 5 different trades to contenders over the last 2 years, and Boston was actually one of them. He's not sure who the others were. Eric Staal likes Minnesota, and his family is settled there. So when Eric Staal comes out there and talks about how he likes playing in Minnesota, he likes being there, his family likes being there, and they've settled in, apparently that's been the case for the past 2 seasons, and so much to the point that Eric Staal has indeed refused trades. One of them to the Boston Bruins, which, honestly, if you think about how good Eric Staal has been over the past few seasons, 70 points, 40 goals, 50 points, 60 points, revitalizing his career with the Minnesota Wild in 2016. Imagine Eric Staal on Boston. You thought David Backes was a bad acquisition over there for the Bruins. Well, Eric Staal could have been the entire opposite of that. This kind of guy was a very, very good Minnesota Wild point producer, and if you add that on to play as the second-tier guy alongside a Jake DeBrusk and behind that Bergeron, Pasternak, Marchand line, then who knows the possibilities of how good Eric Staal could have been in this scenario. In fact, the Boston Bruins, they've been a pretty big powerhouse over the past few seasons. They made the Stanley Cup Finals last year. Imagine this trade proposal goes on a year ago, and Eric Staal is on the Boston Bruins for what would have been Game 7 of the Stanley Cup Finals. This is the kind of guy who honestly can win you a game once in a while. So, just the virtue of him rejecting that kind of trade, to me, speaks volumes as to how settled in his family really is. And let's face it, Eric Staal is a 35-year-old guy. I'm pretty sure winning is important, Stanley Cups are important, all that's important. But when you're 35, you got some kids, you got a wife, you got a family, that's important too, especially for a guy who literally already has a Stanley Cup attached to his name, albeit it was 15 years ago, but still a cup is a cup. But I find that very interesting, though. The fact that Staal did indeed reject 5 trades. First off, props to you for sticking to your guts and going with what exactly it is that you value. Secondly, though, the Wild. What the heck, man? You guys trading this guy? Putting him on the block 5 times and getting a deal done 5 times in 2 seasons just to have him say no to all of them. My goodness, the Wild really wanted to trade this guy. It's actually kind of funny because they actually had restricted options. Eric Staal had a 10-team no-trade list on his modified no-trade clause on the contract he signed a few seasons ago, but if the Wild ended up giving him the right to say no, then that means they would have been trading him to teams that he had listed on that no-team trade list, which is very crazy to me. Why don't you just talk about the teams that weren't on his no-trade list so you can go ahead and just do the trade, which is exactly what they ended up doing with the Buffalo Sabres. This is why Eric Staal didn't put Buffalo on that no-trade list. He didn't do it because he didn't figure they would ever be a contender for his services. He focused the list, the no-team trade list, on teams that were contending, that he did not prefer to play for. So Boston probably was on that. Sure, they're contending, but among his own values, he did not feel like playing there. So that's kind of why he had the option to say no, which is why he ended up not going to Boston. It's just very interesting that Buffalo is indeed the team, because if we take a look at some of the replies over here on NHL Watcher's tweet, here's a reply from Brett Marshall. He says this: "There was a trade in place at the 2019 deadline for Minnesota to send Staal to Boston for Kuraly and their first. And Staal basically said, if you trade me, I'm going to retire." So then Paul Fenton instead resigned, and now the Wild got Marcus Johansson instead because he wasn't on that no-trade list. Okay, that's pretty interesting. And I think the way this is all shaping up, I would not be surprised if Eric Staal left Buffalo in free agency, then came back to Minnesota, or just straight up retired, and eventually returned to Minnesota just to spend time with his family and for them to grow up there, because it really appears that Eric Staal was the guy who just did not want to get moved. So even though that Wild trade was indeed very shocking to all of us, because on paper Eric Staal is very much better than Marcus Johansson, Eric Staal probably had the biggest surprise of all. And if you're the Boston Bruins, you're taking a look at this, you're like, wow, okay, we could have given you guys so much more for Eric Staal instead of Marcus Johansson. Sean Kuraly in a first, much more valuable, I would say. But nah. He doesn't have the Buffalo Sabres on his no-trade list because he didn't really think that they would be in a position to actually go after him. Remember, NHL athletes have to update this no-team trade list, and if the Buffalo Sabres are in a position where they're bad at the bottom of the league, it makes all the sense in the world to think, okay, I'm not going to use a spot for one of my 10 no-team trades on Buffalo, because this team is realistically not going to want me on their team. They're a younger team, they're a poor team, I'm a good player, but I'm old. So it's very easy to see why it would be apparent that Buffalo would not have been a team that had Eric Staal on their radar. But, you know, they want to remain competitive, they want to build a winning environment, and who knows if this Staal trade is going to be the biggest catalyst for that. So, ultimately, going over the main points as we talked about in the previous video, talking about this trade too, Eric Staal, good number 2 center behind Jack Eichel. He can help out the long-term development of not just Jack Eichel, but also some of the other guys they have there too. Dylan Cousins, Casey Mittelstadt, some of these guys really could learn a lot playing behind one of the most grizzled vets in the NHL who still is very capable of getting upwards of 40, 50, maybe 60 points in a season and 20 goals too. However, after 1 full year of playing in Buffalo, who knows if Eric Staal rides off into the sunset and goes back to Minnesota to spend some more time with his folks. I personally wouldn't be surprised, but of course we do have to wait and see how things go. So talk to me in the comments what you think about this whole idea. What do you think about Eric Staal being super shocked at the trade and actually rejecting some trades earlier on just because he likes Minnesota so much? Furthermore, what does this say about the Minnesota Wild's plan to quote-unquote retool or rebuild, etc.? This guy was one of their better players, in fact, arguably their best player over the past few seasons, and over the past 2 years, they've been wanting to trade him so much to the point that he has denied 5 trades. That is absolutely crazy in my mind, but let me know in the comments what you think about this whole idea. Hope you enjoyed this video. And bye.